All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of Christianity on the Spectrum. I am here with DL Mayfield.
That's me.
It is. So, for those who don't know the Christianity on the Spectrum lore, DL's blog or Substack, is it blog or Substack? Are
You
those
can use
interchangeable
either.
terms?
I find
Okay,
them interchangeable. Yeah.
it's the place where they put articles about things. One of the first places that I publicly published my research under my name with a picture of myself on it using my full name,
It's a big
which
deal.
was
A big
it was
deal.
that was a huge anxiety inducing experience for
Oh,
me because I went through my entire adult life being like, do not be seen, do not be
yeah.
heard, do
Yeah.
not let anyone know who you are, stay
Yeah.
in the shadows, stay anonymous. And then I just published something with my
Mm-hmm.
name and a picture of me on it. But it was great. It was great. So DL's audience was lovely enough to reach out to me. A lot of them reached out to me to fill out surveys and do interviews for my research. And I got a lot of amazing quality data from their audience. And yeah, it was great. And now I'm having them back on the podcast to talk about a very, very fun, very light topic with low moral stakes and no controversies, which is the authoritarian parenting movement. Or I don't even, is that what you call it?
Yeah.
I'll just let you talk about it.
Okay, great. I'm gonna jump into all of that, but can I just say something really quick? I think, John, everything you're doing on this podcast and with your research is so important. And I just want to name that going into this. There's such a stunning lack of research being done. And so the more I've thought about your project, I've just been like, this is exactly what we need to be happening. And it seems like people are really resonating with you being like, fine, I'm just going to start doing it. Love that. I just want to say that.
Some people are really resonating with it, I'll say. Maybe people in general might be a little overly ambitious in the description. Some people definitely are, but I
But
get
guess
many
what?
emails explaining to me that I'm very much not resonating with them.
Oh my God. This is the great thing about being a semi-public person. Welcome, by the way, John, to being a semi-public person. You get to realize that niche audiences are actually where it's at. And the people who are ready for your content will find you. And then the other people, I don't know what they do. They go live their miserable little lives. Here we are, just seeing the holes and trying to be like, I guess we're the ones that have to do some of the research, talk to the people. My Substack community, that one is called Healing is My Special Interest. I started a few years ago when I discovered at age 37 that I was autistic, right? So I'm a late in life autist, and that that rocked my world. And I don't know if you want me to go into just really briefly my little story there. Like a lot of people, I was socialized as female and I was not flagged for being autistic. I have a few other reasons why that happened. One is I was homeschooled the vast majority of my life, so I had zero professionals checking in with me. We didn't go to the doctor that often, even. We moved around state to state like every 2 to 3 years. So there's no adult that ever saw me. Plus, my older brother was diagnosed autistic in the 80s. It had to be pretty, that's the real shit. All those classic stereotypical white male autism characteristics my older brother had. I did not have those, evidently, but it's so unclear. Again, I was seen as a girl, therefore I'm just shy and quiet and awkward and homeschooled, and no interventions in any way, shape, or form my entire life. So then I end up getting married, having 2 kids, and my oldest child is diagnosed autistic. Eventually, they get a little bit older, and I want to be a good parent to them. And so I started therapy, and then eventually my therapist was like, why do you keep saying you're neurotypical? Like, why do you say that over and over again? And I was like, because I am, obviously. And then she just very gently was like, you just might want to think about it. And autism's genetic, which is the first time I'd ever heard of that, honestly, that autism was genetic. And again, going back to my family
I
lore.
hear RFK is looking into it, and he's going to find the real cause. So just hold on to that for a while. We might have to edit that out, depending on what he finds. Anyway, sorry
Well,
for
no, RFK
derailing
is
you.
going to probably call my mother, and she's going to tell him. And she'll tell him it's the vaccines, right? And it's the blue
Okay.
dyes.
Yes.
So it seems like
Yeah.
he's already talked to her. So, like, he's basically figured out. So,
Good.
I'm
Yeah.
now looking back, I'm like, did I even get vaccines? Because by the time I was born, she had already decided it was the MMR vaccine. So now I'm like, there's a good chance I'm unvaccinated for all that in childhood, but who knows? Also, my mom was a pastor's wife, my dad was a pastor, and so having a disabled kid was like this huge existential crisis, right? For a lot of people in Christianity. It's like, how could God do this to us? And so therefore it made a lot of sense why my mom's got to be the vaccines, right? It's got to be some conspiracy that did this to our child. It wouldn't be God. So all those reasons why they would never want to perceive me as autistic. But now when I learned it was genetic, I started looking into it and I was like, oh shit, I really check a lot of these boxes. And that realization alone helped me at age 37 reassess so much of my life that I eventually also ended up being like, hey, I've always been gender nonconforming. I think I identify as non-binary. And then I also deconverted from Christianity. Now, that one was a little awkward because I'd been this super Christian my whole life and was actually a Christian author and was making my living doing all this stuff. But that chance that this autism diagnosis gave me for self-reflection, it ended up just like totally upending my life. And then being autistic, I can't lie, I can't pretend. So I had to just rip the band-aid off and I sort of torched my career and all that stuff. But yeah, that a few years ago. Now I'm 41, settling into life, parenting neurodivergent kids and all that stuff. So sorry, that's a long winding backstory to why I became obsessed with writing about late diagnosed autism and why I eventually became really obsessed with high control religions and how they interact with neurodivergent people and specifically autistic people, which is to me such an interesting topic. I think you find that interesting too.
Yes, and as some of you will know, we did a podcast with Alyssa about high control, high demand religions and cults and the weird intersection with autistic people. But for that episode, we pretty much only focused on adults in those situations and how those things come about. However, DL has been doing a lot of very interesting work on their podcast about child raising and
Yes.
in high control religion, I guess is probably the right way to say it.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because people are talking a lot about evangelicals and white evangelicals in the United States, especially because of their political influence. And people are talking a bit about ex-evangelicals, right? People who grew up in that world and are sort of like, hey, we don't think everything was great. But people haven't talked a lot about the specifics of child indoctrination and child discipline that are at the backbone of evangelical movements. And so that's something, as a Christian writer, I got to see a little bit of the underbelly of Christian publishing when I was in it, and it was pretty disturbing to me. I have very strong principles, very strong moral. I was like that kind of Christian who was like, okay, you're telling me to read the words of Jesus. I'm reading the words of Jesus, and this is some pretty radical stuff. And of course, I'm going to try and take it seriously. And then I'm off to the races. And so much in Christianity, in that world of the famous pastors, the famous writers, the famous speakers, like none of it really matched up. And so I've been obsessed with Christian publishing for quite some time, but I started to reread all of these Christian parenting books that became very popular from the 1970s on in the United States and then spread throughout the world thanks to the birth of the Christian publishing movement. And the guy that I keep coming back to is this guy named Dr. James Dobson. People probably know him because he started Focus on the Family, which is an organization here in the United States that does radio programs. It does their own publishing imprint. They do a lot of stuff for kids. And he actually started that because he wrote two incredibly successful parenting books. One was called Dare to Discipline, which was published in 1970. And it was telling Christian parents not to listen to this new wave of permissive parenting experts he's talking about the people that influence like Fred Rogers, right? Margaret McFarland and Eric Erickson, even Dr. Spock. He was like, these people are ruining our country, America. They're creating these spoiled kids who will go out and protest the great state of America in the streets, because he's talking about Vietnam. He's like, you got to discipline your kids. You got to crush the will of your children, and you need to do it every time they show their will. And so he had this really specific formula for hitting children in this ritualized manner where you make sure you tell the child, I'm doing this for your own good. I'm doing this because God commands me to do it. And then you make the child like hug you and it's all okay at the end. And so Dobson's like, listen, this is different than just smacking your kid when you're mad, right? Every time your kid is willfully defiant, you do this ritualized thing. And of course, you still inflict pain on them because punishment has to include pain or the kid won't learn. But you're doing it and you're telling them that it's love. And by the end of it, they need to like verbally agree with you that it was loving, that they deserve the correction, they deserve the punishment. If they don't, you just keep hitting them. You just keep doing the ritual over and over again, right? Until they finally comply. He's like, this doesn't hurt kids at all. This does nothing to the kid. Plus, since a lot of the defiance happens when kids are like 2 and 3, he's like, they won't even remember anyways. Now, he's a child psychologist. Let me just say that. And in fact, what all of these quote unquote permissive parenting experts were saying was basically like, this stuff impacts kids. So that's mostly what he didn't want people discovering, right? Is that using corporal punishment, using guilt and shame and coercive control has long-term impacts on children. And he didn't want parents to know that because he actually wanted children who were compliant more than anything else. And so that's what these books spoke to, is this idea like you could have immediately compliant children if you use these tactics. His second book was called The Strong-Willed Child, because so many parents wrote to him and were like, I have one kid where this works beautifully. And then I have this other kid. No matter how many times I hit them, they're still fighting back. And so Dobson's like, oh, yeah. There's this whole kind of kid called the strong-willed kid. Here's how you deal with that. And basically he's like, you just do it more. He had no real like solutions. But the sad thing is, in The Strong-Willed Child, so many of the anecdotes he says about these kids, they sound like autistic kids or kids with ADHD, you know, and we can get into the whole overlapping Venn diagram of all that. So, or we could just say neurodivergent kids. And knowing everything we know about neurodivergent kids, now that I'm a parent, my oldest is 14, almost 15, right? I just cannot believe how blithely this expert and so many Christian parenting experts say that if you hit and guilt and shame a kid, there will be no ill effects and your child will become magically compliant. Then built into this system, they have built in this idea of the scapegoat, just the strong-willed child, right? The one who just won't obey no matter what. And it's, yeah, that kid, you know, I guess Satan's got him, right? And that kid then becomes the problem in the family instead of the parenting methods, instead of the Christian ideology teaching parents, often at the expense of their own intuition. That's what all of these religious authoritarian parenting books say. They say you cannot trust yourself. You must trust us. And we follow God. So they're asking these Christian parent readers, who are, some of them are quite desperate to know how to parent, right? They're telling them, first things first, you got to trust us. And even though it doesn't always feel good to hurt your child, you're actually doing this because you love them, right? You want them to obey God. You want them to go to heaven. So you must do that. And that way, I believe it is a cult initiation ritual. I'm so sorry if this is like going to be upsetting to people for me to say that. But what else can we call that when you're asking a parent to go beyond their intuition to hurt their kid over and over and over again? Because remember, they're like, if you don't do it every time, like the kid's winning this battle for their soul, right? So you got to do it every time. And the other factor that's kind of behind all of this is Christian churches. Once Dobson put these teaching methods into books, they sold millions of copies. He videotaped himself giving lectures on these topics. They were played everywhere, not just churches, but like police precincts and schools. Basically, what would happen if you went to a Christian church in the United States, I don't know, in the 90s, and you had a kid that was like 2 years old and screaming during a church service, like everyone would stare at you. Everyone would judge you. And I bet you someone would come up to you and be like, have you heard of this book called The Strong-Willed Child? And they would give it to you. They'd have 10 copies in the church library. The pastor would tell you about it. Your pediatrician might recommend it to you because pediatricians love Dobson, right? And so then you have all of this social pressure just staring at you. And people could tell if your kids didn't comply immediately. Like they could tell. And so there's all this added pressure. And in some of the literature I've read, right, from parents in this world who are raising autistic kids, they're just like, I was so embarrassed of my kid. Like it's making me look like the worst parent ever. And I just find it like so deeply sad that social pressure on top of if you don't do this, you're actually a horrible Christian. So that's a lot of pressure these books are putting on parents on purpose to get them to use these methods.
Yeah, and so especially in demographics that I found over the age of 30, having them say, I grew up in a household like this is actually fairly common. Significantly less common if they're under 30, but basically above the age of 30 and from America specifically, it is common for me to hear. I hear it less frequently coming from other countries, but it does happen a lot. And I think for that exact reason that you were just saying, you have a child who's screaming in church or not conforming or doing something else, and then the whole ecosystem is built around pressuring you to this one solution to dealing with a child. And the one solution isn't like maybe your kid's autistic, it's maybe you haven't been beating your child hard enough, and they just continue to do that. And it has a long list of long-lasting psychological impacts on a lot of people, unfortunately. Like you said, the assumption was that these things don't have lingering effects, but it's very obvious when you talk to these people that these have long-lasting, deep-seated, lingering effects. And this doesn't just stay with children 2 to 3 years old, right? It continues basically until they leave their house. Yeah, so we see a lot of that, unfortunately. And I think that, like what you were saying there about it being targeted towards autistic children or children with ADHD, and like you said, very big overlap between those two subgroups, that I think a lot of us became candidates for this particular mode of parenting, mostly because autism wasn't really well known at the time. In today's age, you still find people like that. Like, I'll still find a few younger people who were raised like that, but they're typically raised on the very conservative fundamentalist side of things. And it isn't quite as widespread as it used to be, which is, I think, good.
Yeah, it's still pretty widespread.
It's still common, yeah.
I will say, like, here's my challenge to anybody listening. Go to your local thrift store. If they have a large enough book section and they happen to organize it by type, go to the parenting section. I would say 8 times out of 10, I find a Dr. Dobson book in there.
And you definitely
so I'm like, they're being spread, they're being disseminated, they're still on the bestseller list. It's pretty wild how it's a perennial topic, right? People, especially in these churches, when they're encouraged to have kids and they're given no actual support in a place like America for raising those kids, it's like, here, read this book, it'll solve everything for you. So it's still like a huge deal, but that's interesting. I'd be so curious. One of the questions, just the idea that I was going to be on this podcast talking to you, I was like, one of the questions I have, I don't know if you could even talk about this in your research, but I want to get data on how people were raised and how they were disciplined and how that relates to their relationship with Christianity. Now, I already mentioned Dobson's like, most of this is going to happen before they're 5. So like they'll never remember and it won't impact them. And he actually takes it a step farther. Like him and a lot of these authors are so unbelievably creepy because what they say over and over again is these kids are begging for it. These kids are asking for it. These kids are willfully defiant. They are rebelling against you. They're rebelling against the Lord, and they are begging to be punished. Which, just take a step back, okay? Just take a step back from that. My parents read this and were like, yeah, sure, okay. A lot of our parents read that and were like, okay. And that's the part that I can't quite get over. But for a lot of folks like myself, and again, it took me being diagnosed autistic, I knew we were spanked. I knew my youngest sister in particular, she was the strong-willed child in our family. She was spanked a lot. I was incredibly compliant. I did not know this. I had religious OCD, right? And so my punishments were internal that I gave to myself, always thinking about how to save the lost, always thinking about how to prepare for the end times, always thinking about how I have to be a missionary, right? I'm internally, my brain's going, but outwardly, I'm just journaling and reading my Bible and doing everything perfectly. And my nickname was the perfect child and the Holy Spirit in my family. So if we're talking about like toxic family system, I'm the golden child, right? And these methods creates these toxic family systems because you're supposed to name the child that doesn't comply as the strong-willed one. So I never really thought, I know I got spanked and I can remember a few times, but I don't think it was that big a deal. Then I read these books and I was like, oh my God, if this is supposed to be happening every time a 2-year-old says no to their parents, like that's a lot of spankings. That's a lot of discipline. And that's a lot of being reiterated over and over again. This is love. This is what God wants. If you want to be a good Christian, stop crying when I hurt you. And I oftentimes want to tell people, and I was like this too, so I totally get it. I did the whole fundamentalist Christian to progressive Christian pipeline, so I've been there. A lot of people will tell me, like, I just have the gift of faith. I just can't stop being a Christian. Like, I just have the gift of faith. And I'm like, yeah, I used to think that too. Before I learned about child indoctrination and how a lot of these religious principles were taught to me at the same time, I was literally being punished physically, right? If I didn't comply. And the number one thing that made my parents happy is when I reiterated their religious beliefs. So, of course, that's the positive of the ABA of it all, right? Is like the positive reinforcement is coming from parroting their religious beliefs and then eventually their political beliefs right back at them. The negative, right, is if you express your will and it doesn't align with your parents, that gets shut down. And they believe it is their religious and moral duty to shut that down. And so when I think about the amount of pressure these kids are in these homes, I'm like, first of all, it makes sense why some kids leave, right? You can see these punitive measures. You can see why the strong-willed kids tend to leave Christianity. They leave the homes. They become the black sheep. They start their own community, whatever. But for the compliant kids or even the ones who get lost in between both those extremes, a lot of people stay without ever interrogating, wait a minute, why do I believe this is good news? Because a lot of things that were taught to me were good. I actually don't agree with that anymore. So why am I doing that? So I just think it's interesting how people have a real barrier to thinking about, maybe I was indoctrinated into this religion as a child and maybe physical punishment was used as a part of that. I think the physical punishment sucks, and we can get into that, but I think the psychological impacts are even worse in a way. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say one's worse than the other, but like being told as a kid that if you don't say this prayer, you're going to go to hell sucks. Telling your kid that Jesus is going to return soon and that there's going to be lots of suffering and torture and all this stuff beforehand and you need to die a martyr without ever denying Christ, like that freaking sucks. And this was just total normal everyday conversations like for evangelicals. I don't know if you have experience, if you grew up like this, John. I don't even know if you did.
So I grew up conservative evangelical, but I grew up in, I don't know, my parents weren't like that. So my mother has a PhD in virology. My dad is a engineer. We were a very science heavy, achievement focused family. And so I never really had those types of extreme religious pressures on me in that sense. Thankfully, I don't think I would have handled it very well. Like you also have to deal with like religious OCD and things like that. But yeah, so to answer the question that you initially posed, I actually have quite a bit of good information about that. So when it comes to the strong-willed children, they basically, as soon as they leave the house, they immediately deconvert with very few exceptions. Like they pull the pin run away. Because this is like, what redeeming features did this system actually have? But the ones that you talked about, the one that said you were most like the sort of compliant child, those are a lot more complicated
Mhm.
because, like you said, religious indoctrination usually is plays a really big factor in keeping people in. And so, like, the model of deconversion that I use is the cognitive dissonance pressure cooker. And
Yeah, I
basically,
love it.
for this scenario, one of the ways that I see this often happening is when they sort of stop, hold, wait. What if they're what if I have been religiously indoctrinated? Like, what if there are all these layers that I simply haven't thought about or unpacked? Especially, so it depends on gender. So if you're raised as a girl or raised as a boy, like that pretty heavily impacts things in terms of the types of things that tend to trigger these. But one that I found a lot of, especially recently, were large scale political events. So the Black Lives Matter protests were a big one.
Yeah.
The election of Donald Trump was another big one,
Yeah.
where large scale events like that happen and they hit like a wrecking ball, and you now have to reckon with the fact that the wrecking ball has actually hit the wall, and you can't really deny that it's happened. And so usually that leads to a lot of unpacking. And typically what you will see is the fundamentalist Christian to progressive Christian to deconversion pipeline. And if they don't go through that, then they usually go fundamentalist Christian to progressive Christian to very weird other type of Christian that isn't progressive Christian anymore, but is like through the sheer force of autism, they synthesize a form of Christianity that they can deal with that's usually in a high church tradition, so Catholic, Orthodox, Anglican, Lutheran. And they'll usually end up there as a theologically conservative, politically left person. That's
Wow,
typically where they fall.
this is blowing my brain. The only Christian friends I have still in my life, they're all Quakers, which is interesting. And I'm
Yeah,
only friends with neurodivergent people now because
yeah,
you know how it goes.
yeah,
So
yeah.
that's been a funny outlier for me. I'm like, oh, me and my Quakers, me and my Quakers.
Yeah, so Quakers are another interesting group
Right?
that autistic people are often joined to. So like also nonconformist movements and
Yes,
Anabaptists
totally.
especially.
Hey, I had my Mennonite
Depending
phase.
on,
Okay.
yeah, depending on what type of Anabaptist again, because
Yeah,
they come in
totally.
many flavors. Yeah, but so typically these things have like pretty long term significant effects, and this is a theme that comes up a lot in the podcast. Is a lot of things that we think we're doing for the preservation and the good of Christianity are actually like making it more likely that you'll deconvert down the road. And I think this is just like another one of those things that heavily contributes to that, is the conflation of religious abuse with love, and how
Yeah.
that like really makes them think about, what am I doing here? What were we supposed to be doing? And again, a lot of these people are late diagnosed. So the good thing is, I've actually heard from quite a few younger people who were early diagnosed with autism. So they were caught early in the school system in the late 2000s, early 2010s. And because of that, their parents realized that they weren't a strong willed child, or that that the reason they were behaving that way was due to like cognitive reasons, and
Yeah.
had a, I guess, come to Jesus moment. They flipped a switch and thought, okay, maybe we shouldn't try apply the Dobson approach to this. So there have been a few instances like that. I wouldn't say there are many, but yeah, there's just, it's a whole mess. And then there's also the Christian autism parenting sphere, which is
Oh my
its
God.
whole own thing.
Are we ready to dive into this, John?
I think we are.
Okay, so trigger warnings, everybody listening. Okay, we're going to be talking about the treatment of autistic children. And I know for me, I find this to be wildly triggering material. And after I'm done talking with you, I'm going to go volunteer with special needs cats who are looking for adoption. And that's how I'm going to take care of myself after I'm done talking to you today. So I hope everybody has like a nice thing they can do for themselves, because we're going to get into some nitty gritty of like how autistic children fared in these types of homes. And The hard thing is the only reason I know some of this stuff is because people wrote very brazenly about abusing their autistic children in this world, in Christian world, right? Under the guise of being like good Christian parents. So because this whole situation was set up and you obey God, right, more than yourself, so many of these books are obsessed with theology. And they start over and over again by saying we can't talk about parenting before we talk about theology. Now, I know you haven't read all of these books, but if you had to take a guess, John, like what's the most important theological concepts for these parents in this sort of religious authoritarian parenting world?
I'm going to say it is respect or respect of authority.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to be my guess.
So, like, you submit to biblical authority
Yes.
and godly authority. So they always
Yes,
say biblical authority,
submission and respect to
submission to
authority. Yeah.
biblical authority, to godly authority, and then usually it's like a male pastor or a Christian psychologist or a Christian woman who's writing the book who proves that they're a very devout Christian. Therefore, you can also submit to their beliefs. But the number one thing, now some people are much more blatant about it. The more reformed they are, the more blatant they are about this really important one. And that is total depravity. Children are born sinful. Humans are sinful. And unless a human decides to submit to God, that human is sinful. That human is on the very wrong path, right? There's only one right path. That's God's will. So the parenting books are like your most important thing as a parent is to get your kid to be in God's will, to be under God's authority. That means from day one, you have to recognize they're sinful creatures, right? That need to be corrected and disciplined. Therefore, when they're old enough, when they're of the age where they can intellectually consent, right, to becoming a Christian, they will do that. So I know we kind of laugh about this idea of original sin, but it's actually like incredibly devastating to read authors talk about infants having a sinful nature and being willfully manipulative when they're just trying to get the sustenance they need to survive. And to see these tiny little interactions characterizes that which these authors do constantly. It's you can just extrapolate out from there, like how everything starts to become a sin nature instead of a developmentally appropriate exploration of the world. And just to villainize and vilify your child and to be taught to do that, I find it to be so sad and like a severing of a parent child relationship as it's supposed to be. And so to me, this is like such a huge issue. And that's why these religious authoritarian parenting books, the religion is vital because they use Christianity to say the Bible tells us everyone is sinful. The Bible tells us all children are sinful. Therefore, you must do this to correct, to punish, to control them. And it actually shows up in their ways they view society. That's why evangelical Christians want authoritarian leaders, is because they've been taught that humans, right, are terribly corrupt and terribly sinful and need to be under right leadership and right authority. And so for me, the parenting is incredibly political in this way. And then what makes it so sad is just like authoritarian political frameworks need to punish those who do not comply, so do these families. These families have to punish the kids who do not comply. Now, you had emailed me a few questions about are there specific ways autistic kids respond to these kinds of discipline techniques? And I'd love to like just chat with you about that because I don't have the data. And I used to think, oh, maybe autistic kids are more likely to have a nervous system response of fight. If we're talking about fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, maybe they're just more likely to have the fight response, which is obviously being targeted in the Strong Willed Child books. That's the one that parents most do not want. For me, I developed the fawn response where you appease the person who can hurt you in order to make them not hurt you. And this, especially for people socialized as female, was like seems to be one of the most desired threat responses in this world. But then, of course, we have freeze. I think of people who dissociate into reading, into video games, right? People who just peace out mentally. I'm missing one. I always like peter out on the fourth one. Fight, flight. So I'm not exactly sure what that would look like. Maybe more like a panic attack. I'm not sure exactly how that one shows up for people. But anecdotally, I hear from a lot of people who had the fight response, were labeled strong-willed, or they had the fawn response and were labeled compliant. I'm sure there's people that fall in between, but those seem to be the two most common responses for autistic kids.
Yep. Or they'll start with the fight response, and then after a while, it will shift into a fawn response when the fight response no longer works, or when they just can't handle it anymore because the level of abuse they're receiving is so significant that it actually does just break them mentally and returns them to being compliant. Like at a certain point, being abused after a certain while does create docileness because it's a way to make it stop. And so like that does happen.
But can we just say that's the main method? And especially doing this to kids who are 2, if you spank them every time they assert their will, yeah, eventually a lot of us are going to be like, this is so confusing. The person I most need to take care of me is hurting me. You'll do anything to stop that. Once you learn to fawn and that appeasement is like the desired outcome, unfortunately, you carry on those techniques of survival throughout the rest of your life. And authoritarians really love the fawn response in a population. Can I just tell you that?
And it's very weird with autistic people because a lot of them have I don't know the right way to put this, so maybe I'll rephrase this halfway through the sentence, but they'll have an immediate fawn response followed by like a delayed fight response.
Yes.
So their immediate response is to be docile and compliant, and then underhandedly try to attack them after a while, or like basically sow deep-seated seeds of resentment that lead them to fight back, just not immediately and just not when specifically tied to that thing. So you also get that. And then again, there are lots of weird, complicated overlaps between the different responses and the different responses to conditioning. And again, a lot of these are really tied to gender and gender socialization, because in boys, they are still expected to fight somewhat, like throughout their entire childhood. It's just expected that boys are going to be naturally more violent and more responsive to violence, whereas girls, it's not expected at all. So that also creates completely different dynamics and changes things a lot as well, and leads to a lot of really weird things happening, I'll say. But yeah, so
yeah, just so much to be unpacked there. And I think a lot about like I haven't read a ton of like autism specific books. There's this one that I got because there's this guy Ted Tripp who's still pretty famous right now. He's a Christian parenting expert. He copies a lot of the Dobson stuff. There's a lot of people out there. Some people even take it farther into even more overt abuse, like Michael and Debbie Pearl. I believe Gary Ezzo of Babywise is in that camp as well. But Ted Tripp does these child training books and seminars, and multiple people have told me like they can remember a before and after when their parents went to a Ted Tripp parenting conference.
And I've actually heard that exact same thing.
I've heard that more about Ted Tripp than any other author. And so I don't know what the hell he's doing at his conferences, but he is telling parents, you can't let anything slide. Every willful defiance has to be met with this ritualized punishment thing where you teach the kid to equate pain with love. And he gets a lot of questions about autism. And he recommends this book by this lady, Kathy Steer, called Too Wise to be Mistaken, Too Good to be Unkind. Christian Parents Contend with Autism. And I sent you a screenshot of the, what is it? It's not acknowledgments. I guess it is. It's to who it's for. It says, to every parent who is trying to find his way through the maze to the way of hope, far away from the monster called autism, and to every child imprisoned in its grip. So that gives you a nice little peek into what we're talking about here.
That was how I was planning on introducing my podcast when I first thought about it, but I was like, oh no, I think that, no, not joking. But yeah, so I haven't read that book in particular, but I have read a lot of Christian autism parenting books, mostly because I kept getting weird questions from people about like specific things, and like, where are you getting this from? They're like, oh, you don't know about the autism parenting book? It's like, the autism parenting book? What are you talking about? And they would send me like a book that their parent got or something like that and read through. And there is, yeah, insane stuff within those books. Basically, everyone that I read didn't actually understand autism or think that autism was actually like a developmental thing that affects you. It was all just assumed to be like a sin or demon possession or like the result of a fallen world. There was no actual attempt to appreciate actually your child's brain just works differently than everyone else's, and so you should just expect different things, no understanding of development. And when there was an attempt to understand development, it was always recastigated in theological terms. And like you said, recast as sin or as one of these things. Very wild time reading those books. But yeah.
Okay, so you're probably reading some more of the more extreme and fringe books. I think like Dr. Dobson, he evidently one of the first books he published was about autism. I can't get my hands on it. If you're super good at research and you can help me do this, that would be great. If anybody listening, I believe it uses like the R word a lot in that paper. This was published in the 60s. So I'm like, okay, he knows something. But in his book, Dare to Discipline, and I'm actually going to be reading from the new Dare to Discipline, the updated one from the 2000s. This is what Dobson says about autism. He says, okay, childhood autism is a major disorder which resembles childhood schizophrenia. The autistic child does not relate properly to his parents or any other people. He has no spoken language. He usually displays bizarre, uncontrollable behavior. What causes it? It seems to be some existence of a biochemical malfunction. But whatever the cause, autism is extremely resistant to treatment. Then he talks a little bit about Dr. Ivor Lovis, who came up with ABA. And he talks about this. He's basically like, Dr. Lovis did this amazing thing where he taught an autistic child to respond to people around him by putting the kid in a small dark box, which had one sliding wooden window. Then the therapist would sit outside of the box. As long as the child looked at the therapist, the window remained opened. Whenever the kid would not look at the therapist, the panel would fall, leaving that child in the dark for a few seconds. So basically, putting a kid into complete and utter darkness, right? If the kid broke eye contact with the therapist as like a training. And Dr. Dobson's like, that's just about the best thing I've ever heard. And if you do that enough with an autistic child, they might start to change, right? And it says, although no child with severe autism has been successfully transformed into a normal individual, the use of reinforcement therapy did bring some of these patients to a state of civilized behavior. So that's the Focus on the Family guy. That's in the revised edition. What do you make of that, John?
Excellent techniques, work very well. No, obviously not. It's actually really funny when you were talking about that, because I was thinking back to Siri training. Do you know what? No, you probably don't know what Siri training is.
No.
They basically capture you. It's resistance to interrogation training that you do with the military, where they like black bag you, like put a black bag over your head and like literally torture
this
you.
Is upsetting me.
Anyway,
this is a child torture technique.
Yeah, this is an adult torture technique applied to children.
I want to scream. And Dr. Dobbs is like, this is the best thing ever. And even that won't make your child civilized if they're autistic.
Yeah. There are all sorts of things like that in a lot of the books that I read about. ABA is really good and it will really help. And I often have to explain. For some people, I'm sure maybe it did. But for the vast majority of cases, the point of ABA is to change outward behaviors, not really deal with anything else. Like, it is purely an aesthetics thing. And if you care more about aesthetics than everything else, then sure, but I don't think it's worth torturing a child over aesthetics.
You and Kathy Steer, who wrote this TED Tripp approved book on autism, agree on that, because she's like, ABA is fine, But that's just the outward behaviors, which of course we
Oh,
want to control
great.
because people
I'm
are
I'm glad we
watching.
agree.
But the real issue is you have to change the heart. And so her book is a lot of people say if your kid's autistic, you shouldn't discipline them in the same ways because it could be coming from the autism. It could not be willful defiance. They could just not understand what you're saying. They could have a sensory overload. And she's just like, you know what? Autistic kids are just as sinful as regular kids. So, no, you got to keep doing this. And the most important thing is to teach the autistic child they are sinful. They need grace. They need discipline. They need to control themselves. So she's sort of like ABA does not do enough in my
Oh.
personal
Oh.
opinion, because she's, of course, evangelicals are very into behavior modification. That's just the whole thing. That's the whole parenting thing. And it's no surprise that the guy who invented ABA therapy also had a hand in popularizing gay conversion therapy in the United States. He was a part of this project called the Feminine Boys Project, where they try to use ABA techniques to make more feminine traded boys become more masculine. And we've all heard some of those stories, I hope, at this point, of the psychological damage it inflicts on people to try and convert them into something they're not. But this is just the bread and butter of evangelicalism. They're not just doing this with sexuality. They're doing this with gender. They're doing this with your every interaction to authority, specifically parental authority, church authority, and the police. They talk about those things all the time, needing to have very specific reactions and immediate compliance and immediate obedience to all these authorities. So I'm like, ABA is just baked into this. But what's so sad is for these Christian parenting experts, and like when I read this lady's book, and I read it so I could talk about it here on the podcast, it's so upsetting. I can't go into all the details, but she goes through the horror of figuring out her kid's autistic, calling it a monster, putting all her ire on that, while also at the same time being like, and my kid is still a horrible little sinner. So I'm also have these feelings about my own kid. To me, it had some of that scapegoat ideology about it, right? If you're in this Reformed Christian world and God doesn't make any mistakes, who do you get mad at when you have an autistic child and you've been given no real skills with which to relate to them or enter their world? You call autism a monster. That was her way of dealing with it. But what she ends up doing is trying to get therapies for her kid. You know, she has all these hallmarks of an autism mom. Like, she's doing all her research. She decides that vitamins are going to cure her kid, right? She's always searching for a cure for autism. So she self-selects out of talking to anybody who doesn't promote the idea of a cure. She also resists going to like a psychotherapist or anyone who would talk about the motivations behind her son's behaviors or how these distressing shrieks and cries and all this, like, where are they coming from? Because she says, I don't want to talk to anybody who's interested in the psychology if they're not a Christian. If they don't believe kids are born inherently sinful, I cannot talk to them, and I cannot talk to them about my parenting methods. So that's where a lot of these people in these worlds are coming from. They know to keep this shit secret and quiet. But what she was doing, she was flicking her kid in the mouth every time he cried. She's flicking his hand anytime he reached for something. Then she doesn't go into great detail, but she says, I disciplined him every time, right? Which means spanking, which means doing the whole ritual. So her kid is getting a ton of this reinforcement, right? Eventually, he's diagnosed autistic. It's this whole ordeal. She has to decide between these two different therapy approaches. They're seeing this speech therapist, and this is in the late 90s in Washington, close to Seattle. They're seeing this speech therapist. She's, oh, you should take your kid to occupational therapy. She takes her kid to occupational therapy, and this is what she says, John. It's this like dimly lit room. There's two therapists for each kid. The kid will run around to these different stations. The therapists do whatever the kid wants to do, right? Maybe playing with shaving cream, maybe swinging in like a hammock, do all this stuff. She's like, everywhere I heard kids who were talking just like my son, right? They used the incorrect pronouns for things. They were just repeating what the therapist was saying. I heard kids shrieking. I saw all these kids laughing, and none of them were cured. And she was like, and I walked right out of there. Never will I put my son in something like this. And to me, that was so devastating to be like, you were in a place where autistic kids were finally being met where they were. And you said these kids are happy kids, not cured kids. That's not what I want for my son. So she enrolled him in this kind of ABA thing, and they're off to the races, John.
And it's really funny because that is also the approach that I find a lot of Christians take to autism in general, even adult autism. Basically, you do things my way or you don't do things at all. And you conform to this specific idea of what you're supposed to be doing within this religious system of beliefs that I have, or you don't do anything. And it's a deeply frustrating thing that I see. And I think it's even more deeply frustrating when applied to children, because children are much more developmentally complex than adults. And there is just, like you've said many times, this frustrating insistence that the real issue is sin, or the real issue is the heart that needs to be controlled and not normal childhood developmental stages and things like that. I now have a 2-year-old, and this stuff already didn't make much sense to me, but now that I have a child, I'm like, this makes even less sense than it did when I started out, because I look at her developing and it's like, okay, I don't know if she's autistic yet. Maybe. We'll see. I don't really care if
Fingers
she is
crossed.
or not.
Here's hoping. Join the team. Join the club. Come on.
Yeah. And so I have no idea. However, to interpret this behavior as anything other than just normal developmental behavior, and instead some deep pathological thing that needs to be excised from the child themselves so they do the right thing, I have a hard time understanding it. But one thing that does come up a lot in a lot of my interviews with these people is that they say they had a parent who is likely autistic. And so, as we know, autism has a very strong genetic component. If a kid is autistic, either one of their parents is or one of their grandparents is. And a lot of the sort of hyper-reformed, hyper-Calvinist logic does appeal to a certain subset of autistic parent.
Yeah,
and
totally.
Here is the rule book. If you just follow the rule book, you will get the right answer and you will come to the correct conclusion, is deeply appealing to a certain subset of autistic person. And another thing that you said earlier in the podcast is a lot of these parents are people who are not prepared to be parents, under-equipped, don't understand what they're supposed to be doing. That's how I felt when I became a parent. I'm sure that's how most people feel when they're about to become parents. But what I did is I read childhood developmental psychology, not James Dobson, to solve my parenthood anxieties. But a lot of autistic parents of autistic children are raised in these spaces in which they are given these answers, and they have this dogmatic insistence that if I just follow the rules, if I do everything in the rule manual and in the book manual, my child is going to come out as it should in the expected thing. And I have found from talking to a lot of these autistic kids that the parent that was most into this was often the parent that they most suspect of probably being autistic in their line. And I hadn't really deeply thought about it until people started asking me about your podcast. And then I started drawing connections where I'm like, oh, yeah, okay, if I go back to this and this, I think there might be a lot of ASD1 parents who are really big perpetuators of this particular mode of parenting. Because I think I talk about a lot on the podcast, a lot of autistics go through religious extremist phases, or maybe not even a phase, maybe it's their entire religious existence is basically, what am I supposed to do? Like you've talked to me about how you were raised with this idea that you were going to be a martyr in the end times. And that sort of extreme heightened level of intensity combined with all these other factors, I think often leads autistic parents of autistic children to be some of the strongest proponents of this idea. And I don't know what to do with that information. Like it it seems like a sort of intergenerational self-harm that I don't quite understand.
Dude,
But
I feel like you just hit the nail on the head, because for me, I can't figure it out either, because I love autistic people. And then there's some real patterns of, especially for the undiagnosed and unsupported autistic people, who have done great harm in my own life. And that's like my personal story as well. One of the reasons I believe my mom developed a psychosis and an obsession, and her special interest became the end times, is because she was converted at age 16 to the Jesus movement, right? She was living on the streets, doing heroin, kicked out of her house, then basically joined this cult that said, you'll never feel sad or afraid ever again. Jesus will take care of every need you have. She goes to Bible college, meets my dad, becomes a pastor's wife. Her first kid's autistic. She has zero support, zero anything. We can just extrapolate from there. She was in extreme distress. And because she was a pastor's wife, she couldn't ask for real help, right? She couldn't see a therapist. She couldn't. Jesus had to be the answer. And because parenting became tied into Christianity, her kids were on display, right? So she had to parent in such a way. So I can look at all that logically and say an unsupported, undiagnosed autistic woman with 4 kids, right? And a partner who's out thinking about God and not helping her. Yeah, I can see that she was incredibly overwhelmed. And however, I was the child in that situation. She was a grown ass adult who could have made the choice at any time to say, hey, maybe I need help more than Jesus. Maybe I shouldn't be terrorizing my children with my religious belief, like, but she didn't. So,
yeah, and like I don't want to I don't believe in making excuses for these autistic people who perpetuate these things. In one of the episodes, we were talking about a phenomena where a lot of autistic people, in the cases of church sexual harassment and sexual abuse, will be the first ones to speak up.
yes,
But
whistleblowers unite.
yes,
Sorry.
whistleblowers unite. Many such cases. Unfortunately, whistleblowers suppress is a
Oh,
different autistic impulse
no. Oh, I
that
haven't even thought about
exists
this.
within the church, right? Like it is, there are these really uncomfortable contradictions within autism
Yes,
where, like,
totally.
you say the church's mission is the most important thing. We are doing the best thing possible for the church. And if this comes out and blows up, our church's mission will be compromised. So we need to ensure that doesn't happen, or we need to make sure this unreasonable woman doesn't ruin the faith of other people. And that sort of like autistic impulse, for it often gets mischaracterized as like an impulse for justice, gets turned on whistleblowers because in their mind justice is doing that. And I think this is one of those other cases where a lot of the authoritarian parenting styles come out of, I don't think they're all autistic across the board by any means. Like, I think the leaders and the people perpetuating this are not autistic, to be very clear. I don't really see good evidence to suggest that Dobson or the people like him are autistic or related to that. I think this is like a sort of lower level grassroots thing.
Yes,
where
absolutely.
where a lot of parents who are autistic, because of the way that they think about the world and because of basically an egregious lack of support and understanding of who they are from the community around them, turn to these extreme methods because they generally, the ends justify the means, and having this extremely heightened sense of moral clarity, which leads you to believe that who cares if they get hurt now? If they get sent to hell, that's way worse. If you just think about it from that perspective, and it causes them to go into these deeply unhelpful parenting places. And it's just something that I've been trying to work through. Like, why are autistic parents often very interested and like enthusiastic promoters and followers of this, and the ones most or not the most invested, but extremely invested in this, and I can't conceptualize it as anything other than intergenerational self-harm, where it's a sort of irrational impulse developed by a whole host of interlocking factors that leads you to making bad decisions that ultimately harm you and the people you love. And I don't know, I can't think of it as anything
Okay.
else. I don't know if you have any thoughts.
I have a bunch of thoughts. I'm just going to rapid fire some of them. One, I believe, autistic or not, a high control religion like white evangelicalism preys on vulnerable people. It preys on people who have experienced a lot of trauma. Okay, so maybe just being autistic is enough to be traumatized, right, by the world. Who knows? Both of my parents had really angry dads, right, who physically, emotionally, verbally abused them, right? So my parents are actually more predisposed to believe that kids are sinful and horrible because they were abused as children themselves, right? So they had to absorb this belief that something was bad with them instead of thinking something was wrong with their caregiver. This is a very natural thing that happens with kids who've been abused, right? So for me, I'm like, is it the trauma of just being autistic? Or is it autistic people who had pretty shitty childhoods who were drawn to this world that says, hey, first of all, Jesus takes away all your sins, right? All your unhappiness, everything you need can be found in this personal relationship to Jesus Christ. Plus, you get a community. You got all these people that'll bring you casseroles when you're sick. You just have to show up twice a week with your kids and parent your kids in such a way that we agree with. Oh, and believe everything the pastor says and never make a fuss and never. All that comes later. But in the beginning, you're just like, wow, I get all this stuff. Plus, they tell me how to do it right. I think autistics, as we know, this is part of the diagnostic criteria, right? We're susceptible to grifting. Like, we're susceptible to grifters. Okay, let's be honest about this. My God, like, not taking that seriously and somehow thinking you're above manipulation and that you're not vulnerable to propaganda. I find that astonishing. I'm like, a lot of people are very vulnerable to propaganda, and shitty childhoods create people who are vulnerable. So therefore, within white evangelicalism, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If you abuse your kids enough, beat into them this idea that they're inherently wrong and sinful, right? They're going to be much more likely to need an authority figure to tell them they're okay. They will not seek that from within themselves, right? And so I just think, is it trauma? Is it the autism? I don't know. But I know a lot of autistic people, my parents included, they read these Dr. Dobson books, which said, yeah, if you do everything I say, your kids are going to turn out amazing. You're going to have this family legacy. You're going to be the grandpa of the century. Your kids will always vote Republican. They'll never be gay. Your girls will always stay thin and wear makeup, and the boys will hunt it. Like, it really went into detail about this will work for forever if you put in the work to parent your young children. And what I'm seeing now with my podcast and my Substack called Strong Willed is this huge wave of estrangements happening between adult children and their parents. And if the parents are still committed to this ideology, which I think many neurodivergent people cling to it, right? There's really no way to reconcile, right, between these two worlds of, I was promised you would turn out this way, versus the adult child saying, but I'm actually like this. Do you love me? Like, for who I actually am? And in many cases, the parents are like, no, this is not what I was promised. That's happened to me. It happened to my own kids. It's so sad. And I blame Dobson, I blame Christian publishing, but my parents have their own personal responsibility, neurodivergent or not. So I'm like, to me, it's all a whole system. And I just see how susceptible autistic people can be because we don't want to believe that all of these people are grifters. We don't want to believe that our parents were taken in by grifters. We don't want to believe that our pastor was a grifter. We don't want to believe the darling of Christian publishing was a grifter. And yet the grifters rise to the top. They tend to become like the leaders. And then they are supported by this second tier of true believers. And man, an autistic makes a great true believer. I was one.
It does.
I know this. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's what we talked about a lot in the high control, high demand religion episode. Like we are perfect candidates for that second tier of true believer. And I often jokingly call it the parenting prosperity gospel because it's
Totally.
essentially that, right? Like
Totally.
it's basically like purity culture was the sexual prosperity gospel. This is the parenting prosperity
Absolutely.
gospel, where it's just like, no, don't worry, just do everything. If you just follow the book and do everything we tell you, your kids are going to come out perfectly. And virtually every case that I have encountered, except for a very few other ones or a very few exceptions, it's led to complete estrangement of the children. And the children are like, again, I only deal with the autistic
Yeah.
children of that come out. I don't know how this works out for the neurotypical children. I can't imagine very well, but who knows? I'm only familiar with the autistic ones that come out. But the autistic ones that come out are so negatively polarized by their childhood that they come out as like whatever the exact opposite of what their parents expected them to be, like left-wing socialist, extremely progressive, often, especially these days, openly embracing their gender non-conforming identities and things like that. And especially with autism, so we had 4 episodes on gender identity and sexuality and things like that with autism. So if you haven't listened to those, I'll briefly recap. Autistic people are disproportionately all those things. Like they're disproportionately LGBT and Q, just at baseline. And a lot of them are either one of those things or have lots of friends who are those things and don't care. And there is yeah, like you said, one of the biggest effects is parental estrangement because those parents are, again, maybe also autistic and simply unwilling to recognize and reckon with and engage with the reality of that life is actually complicated and there isn't just like a rule book that you can follow. Like there aren't any cheat codes. It's going to be a complete tangent. I swear it is somehow related. I talk to a lot of young autistic men who come from the incel community, and I have to drill this into their head.
Yeah.
There is no such thing as a girl cheat code. Girls are complex individuals that all think, behave, and act differently and respond to a complex set of motivations and behaviors. But that's not what the internet ideology says, right? The internet ideology says, no, here's the solution. Here are all the cheat codes. If you just enter these cheat codes correctly, you'll get a girlfriend in the end. And then they try it and it doesn't work. And so they become bitter, resentful, and
they blame the women, of course.
Yes, and it's no, it couldn't be the fact that you were sold a lie by grifters. It was yes. And exactly.
And so that's the choice. That's the choice you have. You can get mad at the grifters or you can get mad at the people who expose the grift. Okay. So what do we see people choosing to do time and time again in society? They get mad at the people who expose the grift. In the case of the incels, right? It's women who are like, what are you doing? I'm not into that. For me, growing up evangelical, it's really hard. And I love your metaphor of a pressure cooker because if you grow up in this world, at some point you're going to be faced with, oh, wait a minute, that person's actually not doing what they say all Christians should do. Or you find a hole, or you find out like they've been not giving you the wide range of scholarship on the issue and you're only reading within these specific. What you do when you come across that information is very telling. If you just keep suppressing and smushing it and no, this can't be right, you know what I'm saying? You eventually start to scapegoat all these bizarrely minute fractions of society for being responsible for all the problems instead of like capitalism or white supremacy or the patriarchy. It's trans people. Of course, it's trans people that are responsible for all the issues in the world.
I've heard that reliably many times, yeah.
So this is a psychological thing that happens in so many ways, and people don't seem to be aware of how high control Christianity in particular is like setting this up, right? It's setting people up for when a grifter is exposed, you blame the whistleblower, right? You And a lot of that is because it's tied to our parents. Our parents couldn't be wrong. They couldn't have bought into a grift, right? They're good, moral, loving Christian people. Everyone in our community loves them. This is my experience. How could I ever question them? Because everyone around me is, no, they're the best. It took me a really long time to be like, no, like they were sold a grift, and then it became my job to uphold it, right? It became my job to say, this is the only way to be a human. This is the only way to view the world. And that's just so much pressure to put on a kid. And then to bring in physical and psychological abuse to keep that child keeping the grift going. At that point, I'm just like, damn, we got to take a step back and say, what is really going on here? And this is why I love Pixar movies. Right, Pixar movies, I think I would just recommend to anyone, especially autistic people, if you have a hard time figuring out human motivation. The people at Pixar have been working through some generational trauma shit, and like so many of the movies are about this idea of, was I born just to uphold what my parents wanted me to be or not? Right? And we can say this is a question of extreme privilege or whatever you want. You can dismiss it however you want. But I think all of us, if we have the capacity, should spend some time thinking about that. Is my role in life to make my parents happy? For me, that involved pledging my life and service to a deity who demanded my every waking thought, my every action, my every element of my life. That deity demanded of me 24/7, no end date, no end in sight. That's what I was born to do. I was born to be what my parents wanted. I'm like, gosh, that's not what I want for my kids. Like, being a parent has radicalized me in a way because I'm like, they're human. They're so different from me, right? And it's my job to get to be around and to create enough safety and connection and care, right? Where they get to explore who they are. And I'm like, damn, it really was that simple. And yet it got turned into this, we must perpetuate the system above all else. And I think you mentioned this earlier. Just my last thing I'm going to say, because I got to get going here to my cats. But I just think if a person, you mentioned something that is such a huge red flag for me with autistic Christians and Christians in general. But if someone convinces you that you cannot tell the truth of your experience, be it growing up as a kid in a home, being a part of a church, if they say you can't share the truth of your lived experience because it will hurt the family, it'll hurt our reputation, it'll hurt the work of the church, it'll hurt God's ministry. I'm sorry, babes. That's just the biggest red flag out there, okay? If the preservation of your family, of your church, of your religion is more important than the suffering and abuse you experience inside your own body and inside your own brain, no, do not outsource that. You and your lived experience is the most important thing to you, and it should be. But when you're raised in this world, it is not. And it's taken me too many decades to learn my actual body, my actual lived experience as an autistic person who's often very overwhelmed by the world. Like, that is important. I'm sorry. I feel like I just got off on my little soapbox.
No,
somewhere else. I was
just gonna
on a soapbox for a minute.
I was just gonna make a wildly inappropriate joke by saying, or as Ben Shapiro said, facts don't care about your feelings. The facts
Ben
in this,
Shapiro. And every evangelical pastor has said that 1 million times.
In this case, the facts about the reality of the world don't care about your feelings of the importance of the church or its mission.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, I was just going to make a stupid joke about that. No, but I think that's a good place to end it here.
Is it?
I think so. I don't know.
I am passionate about just the abuse of children is such a widespread issue. It's not an American issue. It's not just a current moment in time issue. And for autistic people, I think it can be really hard to even do some of this work of unpacking pain in childhood because childhood was often so painful. And it could be from school, it could be from a whole host of places. But as one autistic person to another, to those listening, it sucks so freaking bad, but it is so worth it to begin to process and feel the pain of childhood. You don't have to do it all at once. You can dip your toe in. You can do it in ways that are safe and comfortable. But I I guess that's my last little thing I want to say is this stuff impacts us whether we want it to or not. A lot of us wish there were no lingering impacts on childhood, and that's just unfortunately not true. So we have to start to process the emotions and the experiences we had to suppress to survive in many of these environments.
Yeah, and so thankfully I had good parents. I'll say good on them for that. However, I did not have a good school life, right? I
Yeah.
did not have a good
Yeah.
life outside of my home. And having to think through that and process that and be like, why didn't I have a good life?
Yeah.
Why was life so hard? And then just realizing that it came down to the simple fact that I was autistic was not a super fun thing to work through. I'm glad I did work through it. And
Yeah.
I'm glad that, and like, it is important to think about these things. And again, also think about its relation to the religion that you were brought up in. I don't think these things are unconnected, to say the least. And as we have gone through in this podcast, they're often very connected. And I would echo what you are saying in that it's really important to actually do the examination of things. I often say, just do it. Who cares? Like the worst thing that'll happen is you figure out you just wasted a bunch of your time. Like that is the worst case scenario.
No,
I think.
it's not.
Sorry, I should say long term. Short term, it's going to fuck up your life. Long term.
Short term, you have to face that thing you've been running from ever since you were a child, which is, oh, my caregiver's hurting me, and I don't know what to do about that. So that sucks. But you're right. Long term.
Your other option is to just continue running indefinitely until you die from exhaustion. So, in the short term, it's going to be exceptionally painful. But in the long term, don't die from exhaustion running away from the childhood monsters that are running after you.
I love this.
I guess
that was like a more autistic response than I could have even given. Your two choices are face the pain of childhood, run from it forever till you die of exhaustion. I'm like, yeah, that's it. Two choices.
Yep. There you go. And on that happy word, I think we can sign off.
Wow. So, if I haven't scared people off, then you might like my Substack called Strong Willed and my podcast called Strong Willed. I don't know when this episode is going to go up, but we're starting a series on the Hunger Games and violence against children, and how that impacts the society in the Hunger Games books and movies. So that could be a nice way to dip in. But you could learn all about religious authoritarian parenting methods, all this stuff I'm into. I also have my other Substack, which is called Healing is My Special Interest, where, I don't know, a little bit more weird stuff, a lot about creativity, a lot about processing pain. Yeah, that's where I am.
Yeah, the Hunger Games episodes are about to hit the Hunger Games autists very hard, of which there is a very strong Christian contingent, if you didn't already know.
Is there?
There is.
Tell me everything, John. What do you mean?
Oh, it just so like I often ask people what their special interests are and like what sorts of things they were interested in. A lot of them say the Hunger Games. A lot of them used to be Harry Potter. However, Harry Potter, as of late, is, to put it mildly, come under some slight criticism due to the associations with the author. And
can I say it? Can I reword that for you? The author has a special interest in eradicating trans people from the face of the earth. And that's mucked up people's ability to engage with her literary world.
Exactly. And so I'm seeing a lot more interaction with the Hunger Games and with that sort of subsection of novels. And many, especially autistic women, had a Hunger Games phase in high school.
Katniss is so autistic coded.
Yes,
if you ask
me. That is a very frequent thing that they will say. They found Katniss very relatable. Anyway, yeah, there's a whole contingent of Hunger Games autists.
And then they will listen because and then they'll be enraged because Hunger Games is not my main special interest. My main special interest is James Dobson, which is unfortunate. He's not a fun one. So then Hunger Games is like my side one. So I'm not as knowledgeable as probably the people listening. But hey, send me a voicemail. Correct me. Tell me what I missed, what I got wrong, and I'll use it to become better.
There you go. Yeah, so that's DL. 10 out of 10 would recommend. For me, you can find me on Twitter at ChristianityOn. You can find me on Blue Sky at ChristianityOn.bluesky.social. If you want to email me about anything except for hate mail, you can email me at ChristianityOnTheSpectrum@gmail.com. We have a Discord. If you'd like to join the Discord,
you have a Discord.
We have a Discord.
I want to join the Discord. I have a strong-willed, so maybe we'll just swap these.
We have 2 Discords between the podcast hosts. So good one-to-one Discord to podcast host ratio. Also, we now have, for some reason, podcast merch. If you'd like to check it out. If for some reason you have ever got the inclination to want a sticker that tells people in very declarative terms that you are religious but not spiritual, I've got you covered. We've got the sticker. All the proceeds all the proceeds will go to the autistic artists who created them. I don't keep any of the profit. I think that's it. Okay, signing off here.